Another assassination attempt at the Washington Hilton here in Washington, where I live, Kwok. Local news here. Friends who were out to dinner said it was a mess in DuPont Circle as they tried to get home after the violence broke out in Washington on Saturday night in the assassination attempt against President Trump. He, of course, has spun this story into the fact that such violence against him proves that he's a consequential president. But the real news here, I think, for us, especially as feminists in religion, is that we live in a culture of violence. We live in a country with more guns than people, and there are no more safe places, no strong enough magnetometers, and not enough security personnel anywhere to protect us. Only a change of heart and a change of laws will suffice. I looked out my window and saw the F-35 fighter jets performing for King Charles, and I wondered, how much more violence can we take? And with 2,600 people in that room on Saturday night, many of them crouched under tables at the Correspondents' Dinner, I hope there's going to be a new sensitivity in the press, and I issue this as a pastoral challenge to my friends in ministry, to begin to really work with people who have been traumatized by gun violence, whether they be people in the leadership, people in the neighborhood, people in the congregation, because this issue of gun violence is central to our current culture. Now, you've thought about this, and I wonder what you think, especially as you look at Jesus. Was Jesus nonviolent, really?
Well, I think that we have been talking about Jesus advocated nonviolence. And certainly, Jesus died as a political martyr. But I think the picture is more complicated, isn't it? Because among Jesus' followers were zealots, and Peter even drew the sword when they were in danger. So when I look at Jesus' movement, I thought we need to see there are many different political actors, and Jesus chose the path of nonviolence, but Jesus did many of the things that today would be civil disobedience. He, of course, criticized the political leaders, and he had something like the political theater when he turned, remember the tables front of the temple. And I hope that we can see social changes took many different actions. And Jesus, of course, chose to die on the cross and advocating for nonviolence. What do you think? Do you think that there would be any justifications for violence? And what do you think of someone like Bonhoeffer and assassinating Hitler?
These are the tough questions, and I think they echo in our day as much as they did both in the time of Jesus and in the time of Bonhoeffer. I'm interested, too, in the Jesus movement, and I'm particularly interested in our colleagues who are doing this work today. I have been struck many times by our colleagues in Minneapolis who stood up, who went to that airport, who got arrested, and who used nonviolence as a way to deal with the unjust actions of ICE in Minneapolis. And I was taken by the number of people from a variety of religious traditions who did that. I was also reminded of the Vietnam movement, where so many people engaged very effectively in nonviolence. I'm thinking particularly of religious leaders who were jailed for their beliefs, groups like the Barragans and others who made up the Catonsville Nine and the Camden 28. Those were heroes in my youth, and they were people who, in fact, did the work. In fact, one day, the FBI visited my mother and father and asked if they knew that my name was in the address book of one of those people. Yes, and my mother, to her great credit, said, yes, my daughter opposes the war, and so does my other daughter. Good day. And they were sent on their way. And I think this is what happens to people, is this kind of commitment to nonviolence that is bolstered and fostered by those we love. I'm also reminded of my favorite example of nonviolent social change, and I think she really made it. It was Anne McGrew Bennett, the great early pioneer feminist theologian. She was married to John C. Bennett, who was the president of Union Theological Seminary in that time. And she looked the part of the Midwestern grandmother. I just happened to pull out a book, and there she is. There she is, looking the part of the Midwestern grandmother. She was arrested for disorderly conduct in New York for trying to speak with draft records officials in 1970. And when it was reported that she was arrested in the New York Times, it was called civil disobedience. But she insisted in writing that they publish a correction calling it civil obedience, because this is what she felt citizens were called to do. And that's the way I begin to think about the questions of nonviolence.
Mary, I remember when I was a teenage girl, Vietnam War happened. And I still remember the tragic and excruciating images of the Vietnamese monks burning themselves to death in
Yes.
protest of the Vietnam War. And I remembered the shock of the people watching such political protests. And I think sociologists and historians have pointed out, looking at the kind of protests that had happened in the last several decades, those movements that were successful in making really social changes have been nonviolent changes, because you have people from different walks of life supporting the cause. If you use violence, not only it breeds violence, but most importantly, many of the people will not support you because you lost the moral ground. And that is why Gandhi and also Martin Luther King Jr. has been always saying violence will not bring permanent or sustainable changes. Only nonviolence and change of the heart, a change of our moral values, that will ultimately change reality.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think that the example of groups that we've talked about before, for example, Pax Christi and their work in the United Nations, really good examples of people not simply allowing the status quo, but using the techniques of nonviolence and the techniques of good diplomacy and of savvy political work to make a difference. And I think there's nothing else that can be pointed to as solving these problems than the nonviolent social change movements. Without them, we really have no hope. And I think we in religion traffic in hope, if nothing else. I want to turn for a moment to a topic that's been on my mind for a while and see what you think. I was struck by a theologian citing John Howard Yoder, the Mennonite theologian of nonviolence and peace. And I want to begin to think about this in terms of what I call the veneer of virtue, how those in religion, even those with the best messages, are covered up in terms of their own behavior and how we begin to think about this, especially as women. I'm pondering this in the time of Jeffrey Epstein, where goodness and virtue can substitute for money and power among certain men in religion who have reputations for good work, and yet religious authority over women and children who are vulnerable to them and cause real problems. And I'm thinking of three examples. One is Mr. Yoder himself, who was the professor of peace and nonviolence, but who was accused credibly by 50 women of sexual abuse. Another one was the Canadian living in France priest Jean Vanier, who started the L'Arche movement to work with people with developmental disabilities. He too, upon his death, was seen as credibly accused of abuse of a number of people, especially women. And the third example, which I'm sure you've seen in the news, César Chávez, who with Dolores Huerta founded the United Farm Workers Union. He was accused again after his death by Huerta and other women of sexual abuse and rape. So here we have in the heart of our movements for nonviolence, people whose own behavior does not bear out the principles that they talk about. I'm wondering what you think about this, and if violence is a feminist issue, which I think it is, how do we talk about this when we talk about nonviolence?
Yes, I have been thinking a lot about it, especially since the Chavez case. I look at it this way. Sometimes these men, they think the political and the personal can be separated, whereas the feminist movements say that the personal is political. They have been doing great work, maybe advocating for peace or for workers' justice outside the home, whereas inside, in the domestic sphere, they are very patriarchal or very exploitative. But more importantly, I think we need to have this very deep analysis of patriarchy. I am asking, are there people enabling them? Were there women who were supporting them, even knowing that they have been committing this kind of violences against women? And I think we need to speak up, whether they are doing great justice work outside or not. We need to create an atmosphere that women and girls are always safe, not only in public sphere, but also in domestic sphere, in social movement, and in churches. And you recall that we have the Me Too movement, and there was also a Me Too church movement in Hong Kong, and of course in other places too. Church may not be a safe space for some of the women, and that is what I am very concerned about. To create a space, to create a culture that truly respect women's bodily integrity and respect women's dignity.
Yes, we in the Catholic community have begun to talk about this as spiritual domestic violence. In other words, if the churches or the synagogues or the mosques are our homes, which is what we're told, they're our spiritual homes, when this kind of violence takes place there, it is akin to the domestic violence in the actual physical home of a family. This is a very serious question, especially for Catholic women, whether it's on birth control or abortion or priesthood or sexuality. Our views are simply of no consequence. And yet there's emerging now new data on the sexual abuse of Catholic nuns. This bears watching. This veneer of virtue, as I call it, for men in religion is something that I think we women will no longer tolerate and have to be proactive about for the safety and protection of ourselves, our children, and our good men. So, Puilan, I think the question for us, as people working in post-colonial and feminist studies in religion, is how can we bring the skills and the sensitivity and the savvy to bear to change the concrete conditions of gun violence in this country? What a huge task. And with whom can we work to do this? That's what I'd like to look at in the future, because I think we have a contribution to make, but we also have colleagues to find, work with, to bring this about. It is a national tragedy and now a national emergency. And one night in the Washington Hilton showed it for one person. But if in fact people are being killed every day by gun violence, it's not just an evening out for dinner.
This is very true. I'm very concerned about this culture of violence to the extent, as you know, that little kids now have those drills. What happened if there is a gunman at the door? And that really affects the whole country's psyche, reinforcing that, well, this is not safe. We do not have a safe church or synagogue or schools. And this culture of violence must end. I think it must end by cultivating the culture of just peace. It's not just peace, but it is the seeking for just relations in all areas of our life. Please join us next week for another episode of Faithful Provocations.